Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked here on the channel. This is the series where I talk about every single book on my shelves because I will complete this quest. Today we are talking about Gareth Hanrahan's The Sword Defiant, or the first book in the Lands of the Firstborn series. Some quick disclaimers before we start. I was sent this finished copy of the book for free from the publisher for review, regardless of where books come from. Nobody's paying me to talk about books except my patrons, and all opinions are my own. I will keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible while still talking about the book as a whole. If you do want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, pause the video. Come back when you've read it, we'll talk then. And I will link the story graph for the book down below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. This is a high fantasy, dark fantasy book from author Gareth Hanrahan. It originally came out in 2023, and I believe the next book, The Sword Unbound, is due out in March of 2024. No, May of 2024, the other M month. Gareth Hanrahan was originally a computer programmer, took 3 months off to be writing and has been doing that for about 15 years since. I also know him from writing the Black Iron Legacy series, which is one of my absolute favourite in-progress series at the moment. He is also a TTRPG designer, game maker, and a lot of his books do focus on that sort of form of storytelling. Set in a world of dark myth and dangerous prophecy, The Sword Defiant launches an epic tale of daring warriors, living weapons, and bloodthirsty vengeance, is the top line of the blurb of this book, but I do not think that it accurately portrays what this book is about. Picture, if you will, a D&D party, a classic D&D party who run a campaign in which they eventually defeat the necromancer Lord Bone, yes, in his necromantic city of Necrad. And then shoot us forward, several decades in the future. Necrad has been occupied, people are living there, people are setting up ordinary lives there, and our heroes have aged and changed a lot. What does that look like? Alf, our main character, who was kind of the barbarian of the party, one of the very fighty ones, is summoned by a cleric who says that something is going on in Necrad and he needs to go back there, at which point he discovers that Lord Bone's tomb has been opened, which it can only have been done by one of the 9, his party of adventurers. So it's sort of a high fantasy, dark fantasy mystery novel where we're solving what's going on in Necrad now. It's also a commentary on heroes and heroes in story and fantasy novels as a whole. There's a lot to unpack here, let's get into it. One of Gareth Hanrahan's biggest inspirations for this book is a quote from an interview with Tolkien, I believe, where they talk about Barad-dûr, which is... We're not going to get too deep into the weeds for Lord of the Rings because I don't want to summon that particular kind of person into my comments, but there is a quote about how actually Barad-dûr wouldn't have been just left to go away, it would have been occupied. So what does that look like when these evil, cursed places get just people living in them trying to do trade and so such? So a lot of the really interesting parts of this book are how that city is still functioning and the weird magics that Lord Bone left behind and how they're sort of dealing with day-to-day life in that situation. The other thing that Gareth Hanrahan mentions in interviews is writing about Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of storytelling. I'm not trying to lump all TTRPGs in as Dungeons and Dragons, but it is the most well-known one. Often that kind of storytelling, especially if you're someone who's introduced to it as a young person, it's very, I'm a hero and I'm going in to do my heroism and that's great. And you never really think about what comes next. And Gareth Hanrahan was wanting to talk about adventuring and heroes and saving the world from a more adult perspective. So he's in his 40s now. What does that look like? What does it look like to be this kind of person in this context? Personally, as someone who really loves picking apart fantasy worlds and TTRPGs and character studies, this just suits me absolutely to a T. And the thing I will say, having said all of that, is it is still a really good book outside of those things. That's personally why I love it. But it's also just a great book and you don't have to get too much into thinking about that. You can just let that wash over you if you like. So let's talk about characters. We have 2 main point of view characters in this book. Originally, the book was just written to be about Alf, and Gareth Hanrahan was trying to write the kind of character where if you were writing the character sheet for them, if you were creating this character to play in a game, it's fairly blank other than he likes to hit things and he's very good at fighting. And what does that look like 40 years on? What does that look like when that person's grown up? What kind of changes do you have to make to yourself as a person at the end of that campaign? Which I think is absolutely fascinating. I actually really like Alf as a character. I'm really excited to see where he goes throughout the series because it's the interesting thing of if we were reading the book about the original campaign where they defeat Lord Bone, Alf is a very different person, but we'd be seeing the character growth, whereas we're at the start of this next phase of character growth for him because we're reading a book. And yeah, I found him very interesting. So originally, book was written just to be Alf, and then Orbit said, hey, Gareth, love this, we'd quite like to make it a trilogy, can you add in another character? So we get Ulva, who is Alf's sister, and she has been fairly estranged from her brother just because he's been off saving the world for a long time. They're not really in touch anymore. Her son ends off running off to try and join Alf and basically become a hero and do the adventuring thing, and so she follows after her son. So we get the adventure of a person who was sort of never meant to go on a quest, which kind of sits in parallel with Alf's story of being at the end of a quest that he was obviously meant to go on because heroes. I really liked that balance for a number of reasons. One, I think Ulva is a great character as well in her own right. I really love older women in fantasy books. I'm always gonna just very much enjoy mothers in fantasy books are almost always very interesting, yes, to this kind of story. I think it also informs Alf as a character so much more, so he is richer because of her perspective. The other reason I think that it's important to have her in there is to have a female protagonist in there. Not all of the 9 are men. This isn't a Nicholas Eames Kings of the Wild situation, where we have all of these just men doing manly things, but it is very male heavy, and Alf is obviously quite a masculine character. So I think having Ulva's perspective in there also helps to balance the book a bit more, and to stop it feeling like the kind of books that in the past I would have called man fantasy that I wouldn't necessarily read. So yeah, I think my biggest selling point is the things that this book has to say about fantasy as a genre and about the characters in fantasy books. I think that's probably my biggest yes, you should read this if you're interested in those things. However, I do still think the mystery is incredibly cool. The world building is just wonderful. I really like the sense of danger in Necrad that exists at all times and the resilience of people to still decide to live there. I could honestly spend hours and hours sat reading lore from this world. I think it's very interesting. The book doesn't give you loads to go on that front. It's very much set as this is a thing that happened long ago, let's absorb the world as it is now. I'm not saying I would be opposed to it if it came up in future books. On to things you might want to think about before picking this up. I will put a better picture of the cover in, so you're not just looking at it on my screen. I think that the cover doesn't do it justice. I would really love a cover with Ulva on the cover. I know that the second book is another man holding sword cover, and I just think it's putting people off, because if I saw this cover I would go, oh, that's not a book that is necessarily for me. But I read it because I knew I liked Gareth Hanrahan's writing, because I'd read The Black Iron Legacy and I knew he could write women well, and I was interested to see what he was doing. And yeah, I just think this cover does it a disservice, and if they ever redesign the covers I would be here for a slightly less cliched cover, maybe? Though I do like the sword. I do think the sword is cool. Other things to bear in mind, there are some necromancy, slightly gross, weird concoctions going on in this world. If you don't like scary monsters, if you don't like beasties, this is not a series for you. Alf rides around on a dreadworm, which just sounds very gross to me in general. It's not a horror story by any means, and it's not the darkest fantasy I've read at all. We're not quite, at least for me, we're not quite in grimdark yet. We're maybe edging close to it, perhaps. But just bear that in mind if you are planning on reading this. As I say, link to user-generated content warnings is in the description. And lastly, I think probably just to bear in mind when you're reading this is to not worry too much about understanding what has happened in the past, understanding what the world was like. You really only need to worry about how the world is now, but obviously some of that is framed through Alf's experience of the past. So if you've picked this up and you feel a bit like you've been thrown in at the deep end, that's somewhat intentional. It is meant to be a book about people who have done quite a lot previously, whereas a lot of fantasy books, especially like farm boy fantasy, you're fresh into this world and so is the character. So my suggestion is to let everything wash over you, just take in the story as it comes and have a wonderful time doing so. Don't worry too much about understanding everything right at the beginning. Some other things you might want to read if you've enjoyed this. If you haven't already read Gareth Hanrahan's Black Iron Legacy books, I highly recommend them. The series is We've had 3 out of 5 books written, and I believe the next one we don't yet have publication information for, but they are all 3 very, very good books in their own right, and I would definitely recommend them. The other book series that tries to do what this series has done in terms of exploring adventurers after the end of their campaign is the After the War series, which the first one is by Adrian Tchaikovsky, the second one is by Justina Robson, and the third one is by somebody else whose name I don't remember, but they are pretty good. I think they aren't as well edited as The Sword Defiant is. They're a little bit wishy-washy wandering, but they are potentially worth reading if this concept is something you adore. And a couple of other books that play with the idea of fantasy novels and heroes and groups of people and what a fantasy world is. I think The Chorus of Dragons is a really interesting one for that. That's a very irreverent, without being just a fun time all the time, look at fantasy characters. And also the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams is another one where I just think it does interesting things with the concept of a fantasy world and what we mean by that. All of those are books I would recommend. After the War, I would maybe recommend like a little bit less, but they are good books. Overall, do I recommend you read The Sword Defiant? Yes, I would say yes. I really enjoyed this. I read it physically the first time I read it. This time around I did it by audiobook. The audio is very good. Especially enjoy the voice of vatlings, which are creatures made in vats underneath the city, made originally by Lord Bone. The guy who does the voice for one of the vatlings, it's just very funny to me. So yes, would recommend. I'm interested to see how book 2 goes, and I will try and review it and get another video out for that as an extension of this video later in the year. But this is where we're at in the overbooked schedule, so I wanted to talk about just The Sword Defiant on its own, because it does wrap up relatively neatly as a book. There's definitely a sense of future momentum, but it is a book you can read in isolation. Have you read this? Do you have plans to? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. You can also come hang out on Discord where we have chill chats about books. I'd like to say an enormous thank you to all the ghosts who haunt me over on Patreon. They support the channel and in return get early access to videos, bonus content, live streams, and more. If you'd like to join their number, that's linked below as well. Thank you so much to you for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. It's gonna be some bloopers now. Oh no, I've lost what I was looking at. Well, that's fine. I was basically done anyway. We did the thing. We filmed the thing.